Noon and welcome to the Editorial Board. I'm Clara Ann Holmberg, and my co-host today is Mert Johnsrud, Director of Programming for the Meyer Television Network. And we have another very special program today, don't we, Mert?
Right, very special. We're going to have really part two of our conversation with Bob MacLeod, the normal traditional host on this program, but Bob is retiring early next week, early this week, I guess I should say, on Tuesday, after about 44 years with Meyer Broadcasting, starting in March, I believe, of 1939 as a staff announcer, and then moving into the 40s on the staff of KFYR. And I guess where we'd like to start today, Bob, is with the war years, because we kind of touched upon that lightly last week, but we have a little more information that we'd like to share with our viewers. It was in 1944 when you entered the service?
January 1944.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us about where did you go? How did you get involved with communications or broadcasting in the Second World War?
Well, after basic training, I was shipped to Hawaii to an infantry replacement depot there. They call them depots in the military. They're depots anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And while there, decided that there must be some better job than lugging an infantry rifle around the Western Pacific. And I found that at that time they were forming the first Information and Historical Service, which was a group of about 50 Army people. About half of them historians, writing the history of the Army's participation in the Pacific War. And the other half were news people, photographers, reporters, and there were supposed to be 3 radio people. And they had not selected any of the radio people, so I applied, which really was a violation of regulations, I guess. You weren't supposed to go looking for a job. But anyway, I got the job of radio editor in that group. And we covered the war from the Philippines to Okinawa. And I was radio editor of that group.
Bob, you were a radio editor in the service. Prior to that, then, you had been in broadcasting and in radio, is that correct?
Yes.
So that you came in with expertise at that time.
Well, I had been an announcer at KFYR Radio for about 3 years and had been program director for a couple of years before going into the military.
Now we have...
That job, incidentally, was the same one which Bert Parks, the long time, until fairly recently, host of the Miss America pageant, had in the China-Burma-India Theater with the 8th Information and Historical Service.
Now we have a recording, and I think it'd be interesting for you to tell about this recording, how it came about, and some of the technical aspects of getting the sound back to the U.S.
Well, the Information and Historical Services were set up by the Army to try to publicize and record the Army's participation in the war in whatever theater they were set up in. And the tendency in the States at that time, I think, was to think that the Navy and the Marines were winning the war in the Pacific, and the Army wanted to convince the people back home that the Army was making a great contribution to the war effort too. So the service was set up partly for that purpose. And the news people and photographers with our group were given the assignment of trying to record the war for the news services, for the newspapers back home, and for the news magazines. And the radio section was to try to publicize it via radio. There was no television in those days, of course. And we had the very primitive wire recorders, which had just been developed. And we carried 70 pounds of batteries on our back just to operate the small wire recorders. And we did 2 things. We reported the war in an overall way, or tried to, for the Army Hour and other programs on the networks back home, as well as making what we called hometown interviews. We would find a soldier who had done something memorable from, say, Minneapolis and make a recording of it, an interview with him, and send it to the stations in Minneapolis, hoping they would use it. The Army Hour was produced by the Army and NBC every Sunday afternoon, and we might have reports from Europe and from all of the other theaters of operations. And it was my job to furnish them in the later stages of the Philippines campaign on Samar and Leyte, and later from Okinawa. And I believe the one you have is one that was made by the engineers here at KFYR Radio. When they heard me come on, they quickly recorded it on one of the old glass-based acetate discs. And those discs are not very good quality, and this one happened to have a break in it because it was glass. And the transmissions were made, the wire recordings were made on Okinawa, and I would give them to a pilot who was going back to Guam where the Navy transmitter was. The Navy had the big powerful transmitter on Guam, and the area sensor was in Guam. And the area sensor had to check all of those recordings before they could be broadcast to make sure there was nothing compromising in them. So, after the recording was made, it was given to a pilot who flew it back to Guam. The Army PRO picked it up at Guam at the airport and took it to the Navy transmitter and fed it back to San Francisco by shortwave, and then NBC put it on the wire.
Okay, then we have that tape now and the audio and the visual of this, and I think it would be interesting for the viewers to take a look at that. So let's do it.
It's important to note that the first part of it is missing because they didn't know it was coming in advance and couldn't prepare for it, so they started recording after it was underway.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a look at that now then.
This week, the 17th Infantry Regiment scaled the rocky heights of Hill 153 to wrest it from its Jap defenders. The words of the Jap general were true. The Okinawa Jap garrison collapsed almost immediately after they were pushed below Hill 153. 153 is the center high point and the final strong Jap defense line anchored on Hills 167, 153, and 115. To give you the story of this final decisive battle of Okinawa, we have brought our Army Hour wire recorder to a command post of the 17th Infantry Regiment. With us is Technical Sergeant Morris O. Schrader of Carbon, Indiana, platoon sergeant who led the first platoon of American infantry to the top of Hill 153. Tell us then where your platoon finally did scale the hill.
Another company was pushed up on the extreme left side of the hill. After they had secured their end of the hill, we pushed up behind them and turning right. We went to their extreme right flank. Turning left, we moved up on the hill. One squad not receiving any enemy action. The second squad that was sent up received quite a bit of grenade and mortar fire, and they stayed in there and fought right back with the Japs. The third squad moved on up, and the mortar fire continued to come over, and after about 25 minutes, the battle was all over, and the rest of the company could move up on the hill without any casualties whatsoever, except a few slight injuries.
When you finally reached the top of Hill 153, did you see the rest of the island?
We could see the rest of the remaining part of the island very good. We could see all the Jap movements on that part of the island.
Technical Sergeant Morris O. Schrader of Carbon, Ohio, has given us a word picture of the capture of Hill 153 on southern Okinawa, the last decisive battle of a campaign of decisive battles. After Hill 153 was in American hands, the Jap position here collapsed completely. This is Sergeant Bob MacLeod speaking from a frontline command post of the 17th Infantry Regiment.
Okay, this was Sergeant Bob MacLeod. We were just saying during while we were viewing it that Bob looked somewhat like Errol Flynn during that period of time.
That one picture of the Jungle Press Club was taken during our jungle survival training, and I was the one on the right.
Okay, we have here the Bronze Star, which you were awarded. Could you tell us about that, Bob?
Yeah, this Bronze Star was awarded, I don't recall the exact words of the commendation, but for valor and distinguished service in covering the Battle of Okinawa above and beyond the call of duty. I have a somewhat jaundiced view of military decorations, but
What did you at that time? You may have a jaundiced view at this time, which you do of other things, but that must have been very special at that time.
You can't help being pleased by an award of that kind, yes.
Bob, we've talked about the period of time that you were in the service. Last week we covered a lot of the period of time that you were in radio, some of the things that you'd done in radio, and I think we left it at the point where you had been sales manager of KFYR radio, and then became program director. Give us a history, rather than my sitting here and telling the viewers what you have done in radio. I then would like to get into television, because we did concentrate a great deal on that. But give us the history or the background of your radio career here.
Well, as I pointed out a few minutes ago, I came here as an announcer in '39, became program director of radio in 1942. Then after the war, was named sales manager. Served in that job until about the early 50s somewhere, and was named station manager. Television came along in 1953. I guess the decision was made to go into television in 1952. And all of us in radio were very strongly desirous of getting into television, recognizing that there were a lot of circumstances that mitigated against it because it was very expensive, very difficult in a lot of ways. The decision was made by ownership in late 52, I guess, and we began making the application to the Federal Communications Commission, and that is, ownership did. And the grant was made, as I recall, in about 1952, April, somewhere in there. We hoped to get on the air by July or August, but we didn't make it until December. But most of us had other jobs rather than television. I was station manager of KFYR through the first few years of television, and also was named photo chief for television. The first better than a year, maybe 2 years, I can't recall the exact dates, we had no network connection, except everything was on film, and that was film, it wasn't tape. Tape didn't come along until later.
This studio we're in right now, at one time was the main radio studio,
yes,
right? Studio A of radio with theater seats and everything, and then that had to be all changed in 53. The seats came out and the studio camera went in and the lights and so forth. And the first television transmitter, as I recall, was on top of the State Capitol building. That was, how long did that stay?
I think that stayed until the next summer, so it would have been 7 or 8 months, maybe up to a year, I can't recall exactly. And then the transmitter was moved to our radio transmitter site near Minokan, which was not a favorable place for a television transmitter because of its low altitude. Television signals should be sent from an antenna at a high point if possible, whereas the radio antenna was lower than the average terrain around it.
As far as television is concerned, Bob, television started actually in 53. We heard the slogan TV in 53. Were we, as Meyer Broadcasting Company, a pioneer in television also in this? And I think that's something important to point out, too. Okay, continue on. It must have been a very exciting transitional period where you were still involved in radio and then becoming involved in television.
And experimenting with it and trying and failing and trying and sometimes winning.
Okay, what were some of the things then that you can remember that were exciting, and let's kind of work up to
Well, the World Series was one of those exciting things. Everybody wants the World Series. And the first year, we still had no network connection. So Mr. Bill Eckberg and I, he was president of Meyer Broadcasting, still is, went down to WDAY in Fargo because by that time they did have a network connection. And we filmed on 16mm film with a sound-on-film camera the World Series. I can't recall the precise figures, but it seems to me we had 31,000 feet of motion picture film.
Wow.
And that seems like a lot. But that series of 1954, as I recall, was one of the shortest series in history. Although the games, the individual games ran long. It was a 4-game series, and we ran out of film, or would have run out of film had the series run another hour. We had some on the way, however. We had ordered it shipped out. And then we flew those back. Bob Watts of Capital Aviation came down every night as soon as we got the film processed and flew it back to Bismarck, and we put it on the air that evening. Of course, the audience knew what the score was, but we still had a pretty fair audience for the series on film.
And the first live came in what, later in
that would
early
have been 55. I don't recall the exact date that we made a network connection, but by 55 we had it.
And as I recall, the first transcontinental telecast was in either 50 or 51 by a major network. So this area received live service then not very
fairly soon.
Fairly early on in television history.
And we had to build our own microwave system to Fargo in order to get it. And then from Bismarck to Minot and from Minot to Williston. Because the telephone company was not interested in building a system for such a small service. And the networks were not interested because it was so costly. So we had to build our own system.
What kinds of programs were we seeing at that period of time here, Bob, that you recollect that were?
Well, when we first went on the air, we were very happy to get the Hit Parade from NBC. We had it a week later than it was on the network. Life of Riley was very popular. one of the early situation comedy shows with William Bendix.
Great Gildersleeve, I think, was on television
Great
at that
Gildersleeve,
time.
I think, came a little bit later.
And Dragnet early on.
Dragnet,
Yeah.
and later Badge 714, which was really the same program with a different name.
And then as far as...
Then we had some local programs.
That's what I was going to ask you about, the local, the programs we had ourselves.
We had Mike Dosh with his organ, and Don McLean at the piano, and Cal Culver with Doc Janes as Ole, and
that was
Lily
a
and
weekly
Lulu.
program, wasn't it?
That was every week.
We had a
Matter of fact, I think it was twice a week for a while in the evening.
Now, what about other staff personalities or names, if I can, not necessarily personality maybe, but the announcer, who would be...
Well, Bill Owens was the son of longtime Workmen's Compensation Bureau Chief Owen T. Owens. And he was one of our early sportscasters, and he did a Buffalo Bob type of program, Marshall Bill.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Children's program in the afternoon, about 5 o'clock. He later went to ABC television and is still known nationally.
Had a program on ABC, I think, on Sunday morning for several
Discovery.
years. Discovery, which, yeah, and was also, I think, a sportscaster.
Yeah.
Okay. Who else comes to mind?
Doug Anderson, I believe, was our first sports chief. He came from Dickinson, had worked at the radio station KDIX in Dickinson, came here as our first sportsman. Bill Owens replaced him.
And now, as far as the news director, was that Jack Swenson at that time?
Jack Swenson
was, he the first news
was our
director
first news
for
director. He had been,
television?
our radio and television news directors were the same for the first 15 years or so, I guess. Jack was the first, no, he was not the first. Charles Murphy was our first radio news director. Prior to the time he came in, about 1950, the announcers themselves read the news. And then Charles Murphy came and was here for about a year, I believe. And then we hired Jack Swenson, who was a fine news director for radio, and then he also became the news director for television. And the news department served both radio and television for many years.
Now, as we go along a little further in the television history, I believe it was in ¡57 that KUMV in Williston went on the air as an affiliate with Meyer Broadcasting in Bismarck, which was really quite an innovation as far as television was concerned to the air, to expand your coverage area by using what was called satellite stations.
Well, I think it was fairly obvious even before the ownership applied for television that national advertisers were not going to be very interested in a small market that Bismarck could provide, the small number of homes, because television was very expensive in those days compared to radio. Radio is what advertisers were used to paying for, and television obviously cost more. And it just was obvious that we were not going to attract national advertisers with just a Bismarck station, so the decision was made by ownership to try to expand, get a station at Minot and at Williston. The station at Williston was actually owned by the people in the Williston area, the Upper Missouri Valley Television Corporation, which was financed by people in the Williston area and operated by the Meyer Broadcasting Company. That arrangement has now ended, and the station is now owned by Meyer Broadcasting.
And then very recently, within the very last few years, we added another station to our network.
KQCD. So we now cover, like a blanket, the western two-thirds of North Dakota, and with cable stations and some translators, we cover a good part of eastern Montana and well into Canada.
And into South Dakota. We're into South Dakota too. I'm not quite sure how much time we have, and so we need to move rapidly up through the years because we have another film clip that we do want to share with the viewers. I don't know how pleased you are. You kind of groaned when we were talking about it. But should we get to that point, and then if we want to go back and talk about some other things, we can. We have a film clip from 1968 with Bob also doing this. And Bob, was that done here, or did you...
If this is the program, I think it is, when we did our 15th anniversary program.
This
I
was the
believe
15th
we went down to Fargo and taped it down there because we didn't have taping facilities here.
Okay, this was the first time then that we really used videotape.
Yes, and I think it was the first time we had live color because they had a color camera and we did not at that time because color cameras were very expensive for a long time. They still are, but
okay, well, let's
we
take
felt unable to afford them.
Let's just look at a portion of this and we'll hear the mellow tones of Bob MacLeod. And we'll look, as I say, just at a portion of it. So if we could see that now, please.
We're 15 and 68. This is TV 5. Then and now. Good evening. I'm Bob MacLeod. This is an auspicious milestone for Channel 5. 15 years ago tomorrow night, KFYR-TV first lighted the picture tube to the Bismarck area, making reality of a long-pursued dream. In observance of this, our 15th birthday, perhaps we can be forgiven if we take a few minutes tonight to reflect, to remember, to point with pride, and perhaps look ahead. It seems a long time since December 19th of 1953, yet in some ways the years have seemed to fairly fly. And it's hard to believe that all those years have come and gone since we first burst on the scene. 1953 wasn't a vintage year in most respects. Dwight Eisenhower was in the first year of his first term as President of these United States.
That kind of gives us a little bit of an idea of what happened during that period of time. And also you can see how the quality, excuse me, has improved over the last many years. What kinds of improvements, Bob, if you want to talk about that, fine, but what kinds of things, that, as far as improvements and changes in television, have you seen?
They've been enormous. Now, I think we should point out that that piece of, that excerpt we just saw was from a kinescope, a film of the original tape. The original tape was better than that, but comparing some of the old archives with the quality that we're capable of today, the changes have been enormous.
Well, our time is just about out, but one thing I'd like to mention is that I'm sure one of the highlights in your career was when you were elected president of North Dakota Broadcasters. That was in what year now?
I believe 1978. Yes, it is a pat on the back from your fellow managers and owners, so that it has to be a vote of confidence in a way.
Cap to a career that is long and distinguished. Also, you've also served as a director or responsible for the emergency broadcast system of the state, I believe.
Well, I was state chairman right up until my retirement for about 10 years of the state emergency broadcast system. Yes.
Now, Bob is, and I don't recall if we mentioned that at the beginning, we talked about it last year, but Bob is going to be retiring from Meyer Broadcasting Company after 44 years of outstanding, I guess, for lack of a better word, service to the company and to the community. And that's been a very long career. However, Bob is going to continue on as a consultant. We certainly want that to be understood too, but we're not going to see him in his office, and he's not going to be available to us to run in and ask the questions that are very necessary to talk to Bob about. And I think we again want to identify how, in what capacity that he's been performing in the last several years as Director of Standards and Public Affairs. That might be explained briefly, because we want to allow a little time, Bob, for you to maybe say some very sage remarks at the end of the program. Let's talk about some of these things. Let's talk about your position at this point within the company.
Well, I try to describe it to people when they ask me what I do, because Director of Standards is not self-explanatory, I guess, to many people.
No.
I guess if I were a lawyer and had a law degree, I would be the company's legal counsel. And over the years, I have gradually been able to absorb FCC regulations, Federal Communications Commission regulations, which are voluminous, as you are well aware, and have become an advisor to our station managers on federal regulations as well as laws affecting broadcasting. And another facet of the job is that of quality control, trying to make our stations the best they possibly can be from every standpoint, from the standpoint of compliance with laws and regulations, serving the audience as well as possible, giving the best picture, the best audio quality, making sure that our advertising is honest, and the advertising of those who advertise on the station, and that our news reports are as factual as they can be and as fair.
Boy, I think we've all heard from you when you've had some comments to make, whether they've been critical or complimental to us, or complimentary to us. We have about 30 seconds left. What would you like to say in these 30 seconds, Bob?
Well, it's been a wonderful career, and I have no regrets. I've done the only thing I ever wanted to do most of the time. And I'm going to miss some of it, but it's going to be fun to have a less structured existence. I hope that broadcasters will continue the fight for an end to government regulations which inhibit our ability to cover the news as freely as print media can, because we are inhibited by the federal regulations on political advertising and the so-called fairness doctrine, which does not work for fairness but works in opposition to it, in my opinion.
Well, we're going to miss you too, and we wish you much happiness in the future, and I'm sure you're going to be doing a lot of things in regards to photography as another last shot of some of Bob's work, but we're going to ask Bob to return again. This is one of my favorites. In fact, this is my print that Bob, this is my photo that Bob made for me, and I particularly love it. I think it's beautiful.
A North Dakota scene, one of the many that he's captured.
Right.
Well, our time is up. Thanks again.
And thank you.
And join us again next week for the editorial board.